There we go. So, hello and welcome, everyone. First off, there is going to be a quiz this week. So, that will probably be available Wednesday night, but definitely by Tuesday, and will be online all the way until Friday night at 11:59 p.m. So, you'll be quizzed on the readings and lectures since the midterm to present, um and not really including um Thursday. Also, Thursday is a completely different lecture, so keep that in mind. There will be that quiz available sometime on Wednesday night. I will send out a email and everything on that, but you know, um, it should you will definitely have it available on Thursday through Friday. So same thing as before. It'll be 5 questions. Should take you probably about 10 minutes to take, but you know, be prepared. All right, so let me switch to screen sharing. There we go. Today we're going to be talking about the Antebellum Far West. Let's make this so that's that. There we go. So we left off last time talking about the end of this Mexican-American War and how that expanded the country massively. We had the Oregon Territory was negotiated into being the Northwest, what it is today, and the Southwest today was annexed in 1848 as a result of the actual war. So there was this large question of what to do about the Far West. Suddenly the U.S. had expanded twice its size. And lo and behold, a particularly significant thing happened in 1848. Not just the annexation of California, but the discovery of gold there. And that would set the tone for the Far West. But also keep in mind, the Far West became the key breaking point over the issue of slavery, because trying to deal with whether or not slavery would expand into the Southwest was a key argument that would spur on the sectional crisis of the 1850s, leading to the Civil War. As we've talked about a lot thus far, everything's kind of pointing towards the Civil War. And the key impetus to that was the debate over what to do with the Far West. And by the way, when we say the word antebellum, that is just Latin for before war. So ante meaning before and bellum meaning war. Why can't I admit that person? Oh, Kevin, you already got that one? All right. So, when gold was discovered in 1848, there was it um, really didn't get popularized until 1849, and we'll get to that. But something you have to think about with all of this is where gold was. So, there we go. Um, so here we have a map of first just the trails leading west, but on the right side we have the gold fields. So the northern gold fields are up here from Eureka to Shasta, um, and the southern gold fields were in the Sierra Nevadas over here, mostly centered on the American River, this river right here. Um, hopefully everybody can actually wait. I have a button for that. There we go. This river right here. So, um, when you talk about California today, it's this area is called the Central Valley, and right here are the Sierra Nevadas, which is what the state of Nevada right here gets its name from, is actually a bunch of mountains that are in California. Um, but the Central Valley is typically split in Californian mines between the San Joaquin Valley down here and the Sacramento Valley up here. And the reason for that isn't that they are separate valleys, but that there is a river that splits them. That being the American River. So when the gold rush got kicked off, there was, of course, a bunch of people trying to get to California. And so a lot of folks took what's called the California Trail, which is this yellow trail right here. The Oregon Trail had already been in use since the 1830s. That's this green trail right here. You also had the Mormon Trail. We talked a little bit about that in the Great Awakening lecture. And the Mormon Trail led to Salt Lake City, created Salt Lake City, really. There were also southern trails. So right here is the Santa Fe Trail, which of course led to either Taos or Santa Fe. And was the jumping off point for two different ways of getting to California, one being what's called the Old Spanish Trail, this one right here, which leads through much of the more deserty parts, and there's this key point right here between what is now Las Vegas, Nevada, but it's Las Vegas just means the meadows, because there is a key spring right there, and then there was Death Valley right here. So the reason why it's called Death Valley is because it is the lowest point in the United States, interestingly, not too far away from the highest point, which is around here in the lower 48. But this trail was blazed in the 1820s as a way of getting to California. So it's neither old Spanish, and actually it's not really much of a trail. There was any number of ways of getting lost. So the reason why it looks like it's a big bunch of meandering lines is because it wasn't really much of a trail. And then there was, of course, the Gila Trail here, where people would basically come through New Mexico trying to get to the Gila. Of course, the problem is trying to find that river was really difficult, so a lot of people ended up going even further south to places like Tucson, and then managed to get to Los Angeles. But of course, when they got to LA, they had to go northward. So keep all of this in mind. There's just all these different ways of getting there, but the main way of getting there was to go all the way around to modern day Panama or Nicaragua by ship, take a train across the isthmus there and then take a ship up the coast to California. But this was the key thing about what we call the 49ers, but what they called the Argonauts. And the reason why they're called Argonauts is because they were seeking gold. So, with all that being said, California's discovery of gold in 1848 was really a game changer. It was it's been variously described as kind of a miracle because you know, suddenly after acquiring it in 1848, suddenly gold is discovered only a few months later. In fact, California had been surrendered in January of 1847 to the United States, and a year later, in January of 1848, is when gold was discovered by John Sutter at James Marshall at Sutter's Mill. John Sutter had been a settler in what is now Sacramento, and he had a mill that was far off operated by James Marshall. Marshall was just gathering water one day and found a gold nugget and, tried to publicize it, actually. But at first, it was actually really difficult to get anyone to believe that that gold had been discovered. Hold on a second. There we go. So the discovery in 1848 was really a local phenomenon for the first part of that year. So you had groups like the Mormon Battalion and the Stevenson Regiment, especially the Stevenson Regiment, who were the New Yorkers who came around the isthmus to safeguard California during the Mexican-American War. And these guys were the first ones to actually operate these mines. Now, when we talk about the gold rush, normally people think of gold mining as like people are digging deep mines and you have to operate it with a pickaxe and everything. But as you can see pictured here is a much more accurate representation of what's called placer mining, as in basically people would just pick up dirt and sediment from the river and pan for gold. And essentially what they're doing with those pans is that there's little notches on one side of it, and you shake it back and forth, trying to eliminate all of the sediment because gold is a lot heavier than the other elements. So as they're shaking it back and forth and sloughing off the dirt in that, hopefully you end up with gold left on the pan. Now you can see also on this is a more efficient way of doing it. You can see over here folks doing placer mining, and by the way, it's spelled placer, but it's actually pronounced placer. But they're doing placer mining by, you can see they're dumping sediment into this what's called a rocker. So you have this one that's literally just gravity fed, where you dump sediment into it, and then there's debris that's filtered out just by the weight of it. And then these kinds of rockers where you actually rock it back and forth, you can see right here is where you would have as the pivot point, and these folks would just literally rocket back and forth until they have the heaviest sediment filtered out. Well, all the non-heaviest sediment filtered out, leaving hopefully a bunch of gold dust. And this is how mining was done in the gold fields for about half a decade. And so these initial guys who were just going everywhere possible, because they basically had lay of the land, right? There was no rush yet in 1848, so the Stevenson Regiment, all the guys who managed to go out and actually like go panning for gold, made their money really quickly. But it wasn't until December of 1848 that the Polk administration finally acknowledged that gold had been discovered there. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we talk about the discovery of gold in California is that there actually had already been a gold rush in California in the 1830s. And, well, it was discovered in 1838, but really not worked until 1842. John Sutter and James Marshall had actually gone through those gold fields on their way back from being bear flaggers during the Mexican-American War. So they might have actually gotten the idea for all this from a previous gold rush in California. But up until the Polk administration actually acknowledged that there was gold there, it remained a fairly local thing, and California is estimated to have around 10,000 settlers prior to this, but by the end, we're going to be talking about hundreds of thousands of people in California by the start of the Civil War. So that's the kind of population influx that happened because of the gold rush. That's how many people were coming. It went from 10,000 to 100,000 in a year. So as soon as the gold was discovered in December, it was announced by the Polk administration in December, people started moving west. And that's why, like, the San Francisco 49ers, the football team, is called the 49ers, not because of 1949, but 1849, as in when this happened. So these Argonauts started moving west, giving them the name 49ers, although mostly posthumously. We'll be calling them Argonauts for the rest of this lecture. So the initial rush was to the Sierra Nevadas. Remember there's a difference between the southern fields and the northern fields. But the initial rush was to the Sierra Nevadas, the southern fields. But as the years went by, it started moving more and more towards the northern fields. Those were the richer fields for a while. And so these Argonauts initially just tried to pan wherever they could. So they would set up camps along rivers and banks and whatnot to try to pan for gold. And these were really quick settlements. If you look at the map of California today in terms of the counties of California, you'll see that the counties today, there's a bunch of them that have hardly anybody there. But during the gold rush, they were the most populous counties. So you have things like Nevada County, which has something like, I think, maybe 5,000 people in it. You know, this tiny amount of people today was one of the most populous counties in 1850. So you can kind of see it left that the gold rush left its mark on the map even today, um, because of this. And a lot of Northern California counties were created specifically because they needed um, some sort of way of administering these quick towns. Now, a quick town being put together is called a boom town. Um, and the reason why it's called a boom town is because there's just a sudden influx of population. The problem is once those placer plats are mined out, that people are no longer finding any gold, they shift to other places. So they abandon the town, leaving what's called a ghost town. You'll find ghost towns throughout the West because of these quick mining rushes, that you know have all these people coming in and then just abandoning the place once the once there's no longer minerals to get at. um and by about 1854, placer mining in California was no longer that viable, and people started shifting, um, as early as 1850, to other forms of mining, such as actually digging, but most importantly, to hydraulic mining. So placer mining is the initial phase that you can see pictured here, where with the rockers and the panning and all that kind of stuff. But eventually, people um, have to rely on more than just panning for gold. They have to start doing some sort of industrial mining, and that requires that requires incorporating, and that requires making big companies in that. So this the romantic view of the gold rush is often just going out and panning for gold, and that was true for the first few years. But by the mid 1850s, that wasn't true at all. People were working for corporations, um, using huge operations that would employ hundreds of people to either dig or use hydraulic mining. Now, hydraulic mining is illegal today, and in fact was made illegal in 1884 as kind of one of the first environmental laws in the United States. But in the mid 1850s, what they would do is pump water at an extremely high pressure, higher pressures than if you think of like a pressure washer, for instance. Think of using that, where you normally use a pressure washer to like clean off your car or something like that. Think of that, except for hundreds of times more powerful and pumping hundreds of times more water. The whole point was to be able to just blast away the rock and basically do placer mining at an industrial scale. Um, the problem with hydraulic mining is that it leaves what's called mine tailings, basically all that gunk that you're washing away. And it was environmentally disastrous. People were more concerned about getting gold than what to do with those mine tailings. And even today, there's a lot of mine tailings in California that um, that are cannot be that are still destructive to the environment, and there's entire firms that work to try to revive and sort through those mine tailings to try to make it less environmentally damaging. So we're still dealing with the environmental effect of this hydraulic mining today. And so when placer mining moved to industrial mining, um, it lost a lot of that kind of that frontier spirit that everybody thinks of when it comes to the gold rush, because this is, while accurate in terms of how people would do placer mining, is very romanticized in terms of it is just a 5-year period that you would even see this kind of setup, and it was fleeting. These camps were not permanent. They would just turn into ghost towns pretty quickly. So um with that with that, of course, with people moving across the west, and that they would find other places to mine. So the first one was I have that backwards. The first one was the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. Um, in it was first it was Pikes Peak is in the Rockies in Colorado, and the gold was actually discovered by the Pike expedition in 1805, but not heavily publicized. But in 1858, um, there was an initial gold rush to Pikes Peak, to the area surrounding Pikes Peak. And they started creating what were called beaver towns because there were beavers around there, which eventually would coalesce to create Denver. Um, and um, the but the first gold rush there in 1858 was actually kind of a bust because everybody went there for a few months and then decided there wasn't anything to find and went back to Kansas and Independence, Missouri, um, complaining about the bust, um, and trying to tell people like not to go, but they went anyways. After that winter, and turned out in 1859, a lot of people made their fortunes in Colorado. So you have that dynamic, but also um, in Nevada, um, there was the discovery in what is called Virginia City, um, but it's just a few miles south of modern day Reno, Nevada. Um, and they found what's called the Comstock lode, the which was a vein of silver in the rocks there. So these mineral rushes are not solely for gold, while Colorado and California were. California actually had other rushes during the 1850s. For instance, there was cinnabar rushes on the central coast of California, um, which is mercury, where you can pull mercury out of the rocks. And there was like a lead rush in southern Nevada. There was another lead rush in Montana, well, modern day Montana. All of those things were very fleeting, though. For instance, the one in southern Nevada lasted from 1855 to 1856. It was a year long, and then the Mormons immediately abandoned the place. Even though they had set it up as a mission that would eventually become Las Vegas, Nevada. So, a lot of the West depends on these mineral rushes. But if they fail, so does the town. And in the case of like Las Vegas, Nevada, for instance, there wouldn't be permanent settlement there until the 1870s. And that would be the case in a lot of these. For instance, Virginia City, the place of the Comstock lode, still exists, but if you go there today, it is purely just a tourist attraction to go and see stuff about this particular rush. So from 1859 to the 1870s, the place was bustling until, you know, the mines went dry. Um, so you have all of this stuff, all of this sudden rush of people, especially in California. For instance, in San Francisco, and remember, it was renamed San Francisco in 1846. So, like, it's a pretty new town to begin with. But that became the central point of the gold rush, was San Francisco, because so many people would be coming in on ships, um, and departing from San Francisco and making their way around the bay there. Problem is, so many people were coming in to the bay there and just abandoning their ships, to the point that if you look at pictures from the time, um, you'll see just the bay is littered with ships. Um, and much of San Francisco, prior to the great earthquake of 1906, was built out of the hulks that were just left there by people who were trying to go to the placer mines. Um, so that's how much of a population influx happened in California. We've really haven't seen that kind of population influx anywhere in the United States before or since. To go from 10,000 to 100,000 in a single year causes a lot of problems, and come on, lawlessness was a key feature of that transition. So California became a state in 1850, and was basically able to say, you know, we want to be a state, admit us, and the Congress couldn't say no because of all the gold flowing. Actually, in Colorado, they tried to do the same thing in 1859, with the creation of what they called the state of Jefferson. That failed, and they weren't admitted until 1876. That's why they're called the Centennial State, is because 1876 is a century after 1776. So California did become a state in 1850, but that didn't mean that they had particularly good governance. People were constantly fighting. Dueling was a huge problem in California throughout the 1850s. And interestingly enough, because the way that you duel is that that the person who is challenged gets to choose the weapon. So, for instance, in during the same period, Abraham Lincoln was challenged to a duel, and since he was the one challenged, he said he wanted to do it with sabers. And Abraham Lincoln, being this, 6'4", 6'2", something like that, really tall guy, you know, you don't really want to do a saber duel with a guy because he is kind of huge. And so he slapped a tree with his saber, and that was the end of the duel. But in California, the vast majority of duels were fought with pistol and Bowie knife, and especially Bowie knife. And that's a nasty kind of duel, because you can't really defend yourself against a knife. You're like, if you ever watch a movie where the where they start fighting with a knife, everybody's going to get cut up. That's just the nature of a knife fight. So dueling was really common, and that violence was not just in California. It spread along the trails leading to California. So you'd see you'd see minor minor um, attacks along these trails, especially the Gila Trail, for instance. There was a massacre of a wagon train in 1851 by Mojaves, who showed up and captured the two girls named Oatman, and killed the rest of the family. It was something like it was 23 people massacred there. Um, the Along the Oregon Trail, there was the 1851 Clark Massacre, which killed 3. Um, and then there was some another very famous massacre, which we will get to later, was the Mountain Meadows Massacre in Utah, of a batch of people who were traveling through Utah and were killed by Mormons. Um, and repeatedly, you'd see tribes trying to either assert dominance by resorting to massacres or something along those lines, or having um, been led to it because of the failing to negotiate with the U.S. government. Um, and so, for instance, these massacres continued all the way into 1860, when Plains Indians massacred the other party, killing more than 30. So this was kind of just a standard part, that violence along the trails to California brought violence. Um, but also, people trying to expand that territory brought violence too. We've talked a little bit about filibusters and when we were talking about Texas and that, but filibusters really reached their apogee in the 1850s. So, um, you know, before the Gadsden Purchase, there were a number of filibusters into Baja California and Sonora, and Coahuila and Tamaulipas. So all along that border, there were a number of filibusters. Beginning in 1849, there was a filibuster, but most successfully in 1853 was William Walker's expedition into Baja California, where he actually managed to set up a his own government there for almost a year. But then he foolishly tried to invade Sonora, and that didn't work out so well for him, and he ended up having to flee all the way back to San Francisco. And in San Francisco, he was actually tried for for violating the Neutrality Act, but Californians were perfectly happy with that violation, so he was acquitted. Um, he would actually do the same thing in Nicaragua. Remember, people who are trying to get to California are going through Nicaragua, taking the train there and that. So he wanted to set up a republic there, and successfully did so for an entire year, until basically he started interrupting the trains there, and an American millionaire named Vanderbilt owned the trains and didn't like the idea of them getting nationalized, and so he funded the rest of Central America to fight an American. It's a very strange situation, made even weirder by the fact that a lot of these filibusters, especially William Walker, were pro-slavery. And so you can see that sectional tension was already starting there. Um, and so you have these kinds of filibusters causing problems. and really showing that there just isn't a lot of law enforcement. There isn't an ability to enforce the law, and so that led people to create what they called vigilance committees. And a vigilance committee is essentially a lynch mob, but like sanctioned by the community and um, and set up to create the law. Basically, they thought that by resorting to vigilantism, which, by the way, that's where the term vigilantism comes from, is vigilance committee, um, that they could do some extrajudicial law enforcement, and that way the law would finally be used. And so, pictured here is the the second vigilance committee of San Francisco, where they hanged two people from Fort Gunny Bags, as it was called, because it had gunny bags around it. Um, and the state of California didn't like the idea of citizens taking the law into their own hands, and so they actually tried to they enlisted a little known army officer by the name of William Tecumseh Sherman as the general of the California militia. So he actually became a general before the Civil War, but only in California, specifically so that they could freaking try to put down the Vigilance Committee of 1856. He ended up just sitting across the bay and not doing anything, while a judge in San Francisco ended up having a couple of duels. Actually, this judge straight up just started stabbing people um, and causing a ruckus. Um, and so this vigilantism spread across the West and became a very standard part of settlement, that you kind of have that as a stage of settlement, that people would find that the law is lacking in that, so they set up these kinds of vigilance committees. And on top of all of this, there is Indian wars just constantly going. So Indian wars in California had obviously been going since long before U.S. takeover. Um, the Chumash Rebellion, for instance, in 1822 had really upset the entire mission system there and basically started the secularization of it. So, Indian wars were there, but then there's this sudden influx of population, and these people really didn't like having anyone who could lay claim to these mining claims. And so you saw what is called the California Genocide. Between 1850 and 1870, it was fairly common to find Americans who would just kill Indians on sight. It got especially bad in Northern California, where there's this place called Round Valley, where there was first contact was made in 1849, and the people who managed to make first contact immediately started shooting everyone, and that continued for the entirety of the 1850s, throughout the Civil War, and all the way into the 1870s. So one can talk about the amount of disease in that, but that was killing off natives there. But the problem is, in California, more than really any other state, genocide was actually done. That citizens took it into their own hands to start massacring people, and entire tribes were massacred out of existence. There's a really famous person by the name of Ishi, who was the last of his tribe in the early 20th century, and he had witnessed his tribe being massacred out of existence, and he finally surrendered himself in old age. Ended up actually creating the modern sport of archery in that. And the Boy Scouts, he was a co-founder of the Boy Scouts in California. And John Wesley Powell was a close friend of him who created the Boy Scouts. But he never revealed his name, his actual name, and Ishi just means human in his language. So this is the kind of thing that was going on with in California. You have filibusters, vigilantism, and actual genocide. And I don't use that word lightly. When we've talked about like Indian removal and that previously, I wouldn't classify that as genocide. This is very real genocide. And in and of course there was removal in well, really everywhere, but in the Northwest, Oregon and Washington today, there was a series of wars there in the 1850s. Well, actually starting in 1847 with the Cayuse War, and especially after the Whitman massacre and during the Gold Rush. But the U.S. Army forcibly removed tribes there specifically because of these wars. Remember that old Northwest Ordinance where it said that like you couldn't start a fight with Indians or anything, and you couldn't remove Indians from their land unless you started a fight with them. Same thing happened here, except for the Northwest Indians were particularly adept at killing folks who trespassed, and they were pretty effective at that, and fed into the California genocide as people had dealt with Indians up there, moved south, and then started killing California Indians. So there's all of this going on, and then of course there's arguments over who can maintain the land, their land grants from before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So in 1851, the California Land Grant Act required confirmation by Congress of any land grants in California, and that would be extended to places like here in New Mexico. So there's you could see that there's all these layers of violence in that, and the same thing happened with the Mormons who had moved to Utah. Now the Mormons are kind of their own thing, because they tried to basically set up their own state called Deseret when they moved to Salt Lake City. They started expanding really quickly, making it all the way to San Bernardino in California was created as part of that, creating what is called a Mormon corridor. And of course, as part of this, there was a whole bunch of wars throughout this period, starting in 1847. Basically, as soon as they managed to land in Salt Lake City, they started fighting local Indians. They massacred most of the local Indians in and around Salt Lake City during the Battle Creek Massacre, and basically pushed out the population. You can see that this is far more violent than what we saw in the West, in the East. These are individuals taking up arms to basically just either drive out tribes or kill them where they stand. The there were some um, massacres by the Paiutes and Shoshones and Utes that were in the region, and of course, in retaliation to some of these, in 1850, the Nauvoo Legion killed around 100 of them for in return for having taken some cattle and killed one person. Um, Not exactly proportional justice there. They also engaged in slavery there. Now, Indian slavery is very different from like chattel slavery, but um, basically the Utes would kind of forced slavery on the Mormons. They actually didn't want to engage in slavery, but the Utes would just massacre the Paiutes that they had captured right there in front of them. So it was actually kind of them trying to be more humane by enslaving people. So you have that system, obviously imparting a whole bunch of violence into Deseret. Um, and we already spoke about the Mormon corridor. Um, but also the Mormons tried to remain separate from the US. And so they would openly defy territorial officials. Remember, a territory is officials are appointed by the president and all that. And so the they would openly defy judgments in that and had kind of their own shadow government because Brigham Young was de facto leader even when he was officially um, demoted from governor in 1857. And so James Buchanan, the president, was getting fed up with all of this. And so he sent 2,500 troops to go and enforce the removal of Brigham Young from governance. And this didn't really go well for the army. There was no actual fighting, but they did end up having to camp right here around Bent's Fort right there. And they had to go down the valley during the winter, and the casualties were basically because of people freezing to death as they were trying to enter Salt Lake City. And once they entered Salt Lake City, there was no one there. The Mormons had just abandoned the city to avoid a confrontation. So the Utah War is kind of a misnomer because there isn't much of a war, even though it's something like 30 or 40 U.S. soldiers died in the process. They died from exposure. There was no fighting, and by the end of the war in 1858, and martial law being lost 38 troops. There we go. By the end of the war in 1858, there was no no Mormon theocracy anymore. The Mormons acquiesced to having U.S. control, but in the process of this, they massacred a train of people who were coming through Utah on that that falsely named Old Spanish Trail. As they were moving along like through here, they were planning on going down here towards LA, but were halted by some Mormons dressed up as Indians. And actually, there were some Paiutes with them as well, so they had some plausible deniability. And they killed between 120 and 140 people in the process of this, taking 17 of their children captive, um, which the Mormons adopted. Now, there's a huge amount of debate over whether or not Brigham Young actually ordered this massacre, but either way, his adoptive son was the one to do this, was the one in control of that. So there's a pretty significant connection between Brigham Young and, between the leader of the Mormon Church and this horrendous massacre. Um, but it all happened during the Utah War, so that's really the only kind of fighting, if you can call it that, that happened during the Utah War. Um, in response to all of this kind of stuff, um, Utah had to be eliminated. Notice that this border is huge, this Deseret border. Um, but eventually the U.S. government started whittling it down with the creation of Nevada and the creation of Colorado. Remember, there were gold rushes, so gold or silver rushes, but either way, these were kind of created to minimize the territorial expansion of Utah. Um, as kind of a result of the Utah War, Nevada was created as a separate territory in 1861. Same thing with Colorado. So Colorado was kind of part of Kansas prior to that, but it's kind of debatable. You could see that Deseret claimed all the gold territory of Colorado, basically all the way to the end of the Rockies. But Mormon power was severely pushed away because of that. Not to mention, of course, that they were polygamists. So that was heavily frowned upon. In fact, the Republican platform of 1856, who ran the California war hero, freaking John C. Fremont, campaigned against the two relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy. So when you have that kind of rhetoric being used against you, you can see why that, like James Buchanan saw the need to send troops. So do we have enough? Yes, we do have enough time. Good. With all of that, there was the question of what to do about the territory that Texas had claimed during the Mexican-American War. Remember, it was started because of a fight right here. Well, it's not exactly clear where, but somewhere around here. The Nueces goes along here, and it happened between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. And that's what sparked off the Mexican-American War, if you remember from last time. But they also claimed everything east of the Rio Grande. Everything. That includes where we are currently. Well, depends on if you're at home, because if you're at home and across the river right now, then technically you were on the New Mexico side according to Texas. But at the university is definitely on the even Old Town is on the east side of the river. So they claimed Santa Fe as part of Texas. And this became kind of a problem because, they'd never been able to maintain that. And the creation of the Kearney Code in 1846 set up the rule of law under American rule in New Mexico as a separate entity from Texas. So even the U.S. acknowledged that New Mexico was separate from Texas. And so the Texas actually tried to send officials there. They sent a sheriff and some inspectors in 1849, and even some tax collectors, which were immediately kicked out of New Mexico because New Mexico actually has a long history of beating Texas over and over and over again. Texas is actually not that not that particularly capable of trying to enforce their claim to New Mexico. So um, after those officials were rebuffed, New Mexico tried to come in as a state themselves in 1850. Um, but part of the problem is that the drafted New Mexico Constitution, which, mind you, New Mexico definitely had enough people to claim statehood, but in 1850, saying that you didn't want slavery, which was in the drafted Constitution, was a big deal that would upset the balance. Remember, California was admitted in 1850. And Texas still wanted to claim New Mexico as her own. And they started gathering up a militia to invade New Mexico in 1850. So things are looking really bad. And in fact, a Kentucky senator by the name of Underwood said, should Texas raise troops and march them into New Mexico for any such purpose, she would be making war against the United States, and all engaged would commit the overt act of treason and subject themselves to the traitor's doom. Remember, treason is constitutionally required to be punished by death. We literally cannot get rid of that unless we have a constitutional amendment. And he's advocating putting to death any Texan who invades New Mexico. And he said that on the Senate floor to applause, except for from the Texan senators who obviously did not like that. So we got this huge situation that is developing surrounding the what to do between these competing claims. And so the Compromise of 1850 was struck, bringing in California as a free state, making New Mexico and Utah territories, and saying that putting the border where it is today in terms of the Texas-New Mexico border. Basically settling the age-long dispute over where Texan claims lie. And that Compromise of 1850 will be where we start off next time on the sectional crisis, which was all about the expansion of slavery into the West. So you can see with all of this stuff, there's just a lot of violence throughout the period, trying to incorporate what the newly annexed territories would be. So hold on a second. Let me switch to stop sharing. There we go. So we'll see how good we can have a discussion right now, but we've talked about filibusters, vigilantism, genocide, Indian wars, various massacres, just constant fighting everywhere. And of course, just the huge influx of population into California. So take a few minutes to think about this before immediately typing into the group chat or unmuting yourself and saying so. But why does that sudden influx entail violence? Why were so many people, when so many people were moving west, why did that mean that there would be violence?
Could it be disputes over land?
There's definitely that, yeah. But how so?
Well, if everybody's claiming the same patch of land, who's to say that fighting won't break out? Because wouldn't it be like, how do I describe it? Like, let's just say there's a patch of land that you find one week, you go, I don't know, somewhere else, and then it's kind of like you said with the who's to say who lays claim to what piece of land? Like, there's no higher orders giving out that land or saying that this land belongs to you. So there's a lot of disputes over what land belongs to what person or people.
In some ways, but like you can definitely see that a lot of this doesn't really is more like, for instance, like is a filibuster about disputing claims or making new ones? You know, is the is like the how is the Mountain Meadows massacre, for instance, related to disputed claims? There's um you know, you can definitely say that, especially in the Indian Wars, and especially the California genocide, where, you know, people are trying to like the California genocide got so bad at points where people were literally like poisoning bread and leaving it out for Indians to find and, you know, poison themselves. So there was actually chemical warfare as part of this, and people would boast about like how many um, you know, scalps they had taken and that. And in fact, in California, there were scalp bounties at times, and California actually created an entire system for that stuff. So, especially when it comes to Indians, you can definitely say that. But how does that relate to vigilantism or filibusters? Andrew says everyone is fighting for the same wealth, either that being precious metal, material, or land. So, yeah, and by you can bring in basically fighting over resources, right? That's a standard explanation for warfare, but it doesn't quite explain vigilantism, does it? Vigilantism is, you know, a group of people trying to institute the law, um, you know, trying to fight lawlessness. California, by the way, had the highest murder rate of any point in time throughout the entire history of the United States during the gold rush. The highest murder rate. We're talking triple digits at points. There has never been that much murder at any point in the history of the United States when compared to California. So, um, you know, there's more to it than just that, than just, you know, claims to material, claims to land. Dante says larger populations needed more land in order to live and continue to expand, and or keeping land to try and fight for their natural way of life. You can definitely that's you know, continuing what we were talking about before. It's you can definitely argue that with the Indian Wars, but there's something deeper here.
Was it
Um,
because I was gonna say because there was less like government authority and it was more people just you know sort of doing their own thing, and so since there wasn't that, like there's less settled people and less, I guess, government authority, they felt like they could do what they wanted, sort of.
mhm. You could definitely argue that the that um, in fact that's kind of what a lot of what's called orthodox historians argue, is that essentially there wasn't any government authority, and you know, vigilantism was necessary to institute that. But realize that's basically arguing that lynching is good, and well, you know, there's a bit of a problem with saying something like that, isn't there? Um, you know, or you're at least saying like lynching is necessary. Um, and you know, why? why would a group of people have to take the law into their own hands when they are the people? Why can't they just make the law happen? Andrew says the US government not taking initial action led to, quote, the people, unquote, taking action. Whoever had the most resources controlled the land. Kind of, yes. Um, the for instance, a lot of the time when it came to vigilance committees, it was always um, the people who had the most prominent members of society were the leaders of the vigilance committees. For instance, one that I've done a lot of study into is in a place called San Luis Obispo, California. It's just a county down from Monterey, if you remember where Monterey is. And most of the leadership were very prominent members. In fact, where the lynchings took place was just kitty corner from the leader of the vigilance committee's house, a guy named John Wilson, and where the history museum is today, and the the vigilantes were John Wilson was literally the richest person in the county at the time. So the leader is also the richest person in the county, the biggest landowner, and all that kind of stuff. But also his son-in-law would later become the only California. By the way, the word California means people who were in California prior to annexation. So the only California governor of the U.S. state of California was his son-in-law, and he was also kind of the most violent of the vigilantes in San Luis Obispo. So absolutely, like the people who own the land, who have the most power, and therefore will take the law into their own hand if they feel necessary. San Luis Obispo, for instance, killed around 25 people, lynched around 25 people over the course of the 1850s and early 1860s. So this is, a pretty bad thing. Also, there was a huge massacre there that killed 10 people right at the beginning of the gold rush in 1848. So Andrew says nearly every decision is made monetarily, and you could definitely argue that. But there's a cultural element to this, right? And it has to do with what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the semester, is this debate over slavery, and this debate over what to do with the West. Why is there a debate to be had? Think about it in terms of culture. We've only got a minute left, so any answers? Well, to leave it off, since we are right at the end, a sudden influx of people is going to cause violence basically no matter what, right? It's literally a clash of cultures. The US had to figure out how to incorporate the West, how to who was to be counted as American, who to be excluded, and that's not exactly about competing claims to the land. That's more about who these people are. And that is the key debate over what to do with Western lands. You have a bunch of Hispanic people, and there's a huge debate over whether or not they count as American. And there's, of course, Indians who are, by popular consensus, excluded. So a lot of this violence comes down to picking and choosing who shall be incorporated into the American nation. I will leave you guys at that, and have a nice day.